In the last video, I taught you about const, which is a second way to create variables that works very similar to let. And in this video, I want to talk about the var keyword, which is the third and final way to create variables in JavaScript. So let's take our normal let a equal 1 and just console log a. This is what we're used to. This is what we've been doing for a while now. And we, learned in the last video, we could replace this with const if a never changes. But the third way to define variables is with the keyword var, which just stands for variable, var. And now when we save, we get the exact same result being printed out. So now why would you want to use var instead of let or const? Well, in my opinion, you should almost never use var. Originally, when JavaScript was first created, var was the only way to create variables. Then later, they added let and const as two more ways to create variables. And the reason that they did this is because var acts very strangely compared to how variables would normally work in other programming languages, and very different than how let and const work. If you remember correctly in the last section of the course where I talked all about scoping and how let and const are only available within their scope, var is different because it's available outside of its scope. So let's just come in here, let's create a scope with some curly braces, and we'll say let a equal 1. Let's just get rid of all this code up here. So all we have is let a equal 1, and inside of here we'll console.log a, and then run this, you'll see 1 gets printed out. But if we move this log outside of the scope into its own scope here and log, you'll now see we get an error because it says reference a is not defined. As we can see, whoops, if we just click play here, we can see that inside of our console here, uncaught reference error, a is not defined. It's because there's no a in this scope. The a is only available within this inner scope, which is not accessible on the outside. Var is different though. It doesn't care about scope. As soon as you define a var variable, it is available everywhere. So now if we run this, you can see it prints out 1. This is very tricky behavior. Essentially, var breaks all of the scoping rules that we're used to, so I generally don't like to use var, because why would you want to break all of your scoping rules and have something that doesn't work like everything else? It just goes against everything that makes sense in JavaScript, so var is kind of the oddball out where it does that. Another interesting thing about var is it actually does hoisting. So if we come down here and we create var a equals 1, this is going to do something really interesting. Let's put our log down here as well. If we run this with let, you'll see we get an error. Let's just say let a, we'll run, and it says reference error. Let's just click play, go to the console, reference error, cannot access a before initialization, because we're trying to access a up here before we initialize it, because it runs from top to bottom, as I've mentioned before. But with var, this is actually hoisted to the top of our file. So now if we save, you'll see we get undefined being printed and then 1. And that's because just like with functions, when we define something with the var keyword, essentially what it does is it says, okay, we have a variable with var. This variable is called a. Let's define this up here, and it defines it as undefined. And then what it says down here is essentially the same as redefining a equal to 1. So every time you have a var variable, it moves it to the top, sets it to undefined, and then just makes it so that you redefine your variable down here. And as you see, if we save, we get the same results. So it hoists the variable declaration up without actually declaring a specific value for it. Another interesting thing about var, which is very weird, is you can just redefine a var variable with the var keyword. So we have var up here and var down here, and we save, and it runs just fine. But if we'd already used let for both of these, you'll see that we get an error. And this is a very helpful error. You'll see it says uncaught syntax error, identifier a has already been declared, because we're trying to create two variables with the same name. But var, all it does is just overwrite the existing a variable. It's very confusing. It just goes against everything we're used to. And this is why I never use var. I recommend always using let or const and never touching var, because it's an older way of doing things in JavaScript, and it goes against pretty much everything related to modern JavaScript. So I just recommend knowing that var exists, but never use it. Now in the next video, we're going to talk about another one of the most confusing topics in JavaScript, and that is type coercion, so I can't wait to see you in that video.